Right, we are now live for the April AMA, that is Ask Me Anything session, and we'll go about an hour and a half. I see a lot of questions for me here already, and unfortunately, I don't see some of the questions that I saw people posting earlier today, so I'm not sure what the issue is with YouTube with that, but I do remember one of them at least had to do with philosophy of science and the problem of demarcating science from other things. So I'm going to take a stab at what I can remember glancing at it, seeing there this morning, and then I'll pick up some of these other questions that people have posted. So the question was basically about how do we set out lines or criteria that differentiates real science from things that pretend to be science but aren't science, and do I follow this person or this person on it? And I'll tell you, I'm not a philosopher or science person to begin with. I had to study some of that back in grad school, but it's not an area of my focus. But there are two closely connected things that do fit into my reading research interests. One of those is differentiating between disciplines per se, right? So not just like, is this science, or is this pseudoscience, or is this science, or is this philosophy of science, or things like that, but also like, where does philosophy end and something else begin, or vice versa? And I think those are important things to explore. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. The other thing that I do want to say is I think that in our time, it's not just about it's not just about science versus pseudoscience. Very often, you can have good, well done scientific studies, and then the way that they're reported steers us into something that I'm not going to call pseudoscience, but I'm going to call badly, reported or badly interpreted science, where people make all sorts of vast, sweeping claims, and this happens with interpretations of things in food and nutrition. This happens when it comes to really anything that has to do with psychology. We did a few studies on 28 subjects, and now we know that there's an absolute difference between people of this type and this type. That's the way reporters report it. And in the process, what could be originally decent science, and then there's a lot of, how did you set up the study? Did you tweak the information that you got? Massage the statistics, as we say, or did you actually do good interpretation? Let's assume everything's okay on that end. By the time that it comes out, of a think tank or science reporting or something like that, it might be absolute garbage and just fit into ideology. And that's often the case in our society. So I think that part of the discipline of critical thinking is actually helping people to differentiate between those two. When it comes back to the question of how do you set down borderlines between say philosophy on this side, and it could be history of philosophy, it could be science, it could be religion and theology, it could be philosophy and psychology. All of these dividing lines are arbitrary. None of them are universally bought into by anybody on either side. And they almost always involve philosophical assumptions in how the lines are drawn. So I prefer to look at it in terms of continua rather than sharp dividing lines. A lot of very schematic thinkers love those sorts of things where you can say, well, here's the definition. But the problem is that within the world of philosophy, in its history, you can take any one of those things and just take the difference between philosophy and theology. There isn't any agreed upon thing. There's locally agreed upon dividing lines, and then those will lose their validity in about 100 years when nobody in that community is really doing anything anymore. So I think that's an important issue to think about. All right, so I don't remember what the other questions that people had posed before all these other questions came in were, so perhaps if they're here, they can repost those. I'm going to take the questions that are here now. So Isaac says, where do your students struggle the most when reading the Euthyphro or the Meno? Thanks for all the content. It's been helpful. So Yeah, that's a good question. Where do they struggle the most? I would say, most of my students in general throughout my career, they don't have a background in philosophy and they're not getting much of background in philosophy as content. And they're also not getting introduced, even if they have like instructors who pride themselves on using the Socratic method. Usually they're not, it's done by like high school teachers who don't know anything about Socrates, quite frankly. And so usually I get people who are like proverbially off the bus, right? And they find it very difficult sometimes to figure out exactly what is being put forward. Sometimes because the texts themselves are tricky and the translations. I use public domain translations rather than very recent translations. So sometimes the old-fashioned language can be an obstacle to them. But figuring out who is saying what and why is often a difficulty for students. I think another big problem, and I won't say that this is like a stumbling block in terms of the content, but I think a lot of students don't realize that you need to read and reread these texts multiple times in order to really understand what's going on. And it may be useful to like check out secondary sources in between readings, but reading a philosophy text is not the same thing as reading a novel, unless it's a very philosophical novel, right? Like Dostoevsky or R. Scott Bakker or Ursula K. Le Guin. So those are some problems. I think a lot of students, when it comes to the Meno, this is actually a great question. When it comes to the Meno and when it comes to the Euthyphro, I think a lot of students approach them with the mindset of, let's call it Christian atheist polemics, right? So they have a monotheistic conception of God in mind, and that's not what the ancient Greeks were working with. Certainly not in those dialogues. In the Euthyphro, gods get angry with each other, so that's kind of that's ruled out basically in classical theism. And atheists, love to like, where's the Euthyphro dilemma, right? And they're too focused on that, and they're not focused enough about on what else is going on in the dialogue and what the arguments actually are. So people come to it, you can say, with filters or an agenda, and that stands in the way of genuine comprehension of the text and what's being said and its importance. With the Meno, it's not obviously the Euthyphro dilemma that's at stake. Instead, it's like the doctrine of recollection and its connection to like being in a previous life. So there's a metaphysics of the soul involved, and people are like, oh yeah, I understand that. That's like Christianity. Well, no, not exactly. It's quite different. And atheists will be, there's no such thing as a soul. Well, let's actually see what Plato's saying. Before we reject it out of hand. So I think students that are too committed to those sort of things that come up in essentially the intellectual culture wars stand in their own way of understanding the text. So, all right, let me take this question from Mickey. Is anxiety an all-consuming unhistorical state, or is there a scale to it? Where and when does a metaphysics understanding take place during anxiety? So if you're talking about something like Heideggerian anxiety or angst, is it a unhistorical state? It unhistorical in the sense that it would be present for human beings, qua human beings throughout their history, sure. But I mean, for somebody like Heidegger, or really anybody else who picks up on that notion of anxiety as being there but being covered over, we exist in history. So it's not a totally ahistorical state, right? Your anxiety would be oriented by things. So like when I was a kid, there was a lot of anxiety about the fact that the US and the Soviet Union were basically poised to blow up the planet. And if they didn't do that, maybe a world war would break out of NATO versus the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact. And then we wouldn't finish high school, we'd get drafted and probably die. And I can tell you that when I was a combat engineer in the Army stationed in Germany, not that far from the Czech border, And this is before the wall came down and the Velvet Revolution and the Soviet Union opening up and all that sort of stuff. We had a sort of sense of anxiety about the fact that we had a 30-minute lifespan if there was a war as combat engineers, and the fact that we were constantly doing training about nuclear, biological, chemical weapons, and we had to be worried about nerve gas and stuff like that. So the anxiety can be oriented by historical situations or by what your own smaller history is. If you've been traumatized, then anxiety can kind of center on that. So I think if you accept that that notion, and there's kind of like a continuum. There's like anxiety about having freedom and being responsible for it. This is something the existentialists talk about a lot. And then there's anxiety like oh shit, what's going to happen? And there it sort of can fade into more determinate fears. And then there's all this other stuff in between. So that's sort of an existentialist take on all of that. All right, Natalie says, many seem to think the West is going through a meaning crisis of some kind, that nihilism is increasingly pervasive in our culture. You would love to hear my thoughts on this. I think that is the case, but I also think that it's not something new. It's like, people maybe every 20 years or so start recycling this stuff, but it's not something radically new. I mean, Nietzsche thought, and this is back in the in the end of the 19th century, not even in its last decade, in the 1880s, that nihilism was like the coming crisis for the 20th century. And what are we going to do about it? And I think there's something to that. There's a great book by Michael Harrington that was written in the early 80s called The Politics at God's Funeral. This is something that we've been noticing for a long time. And there is a lot of stuff that's ultimately, you could say, grounded on nothing, even though it appears to be, quite robust. A lot of appeals to tradition are quite, frankly, nihilistic when you get down to what tradition counts for these people that are doing it. But it's manageable. It's not something that we don't have like a long track record of people attempting to conceptualize and deal with. So I think there's a lot of resources out there for addressing it. Thanks to Elijah. That's very nice. If you have a question, I'll look for that. Rapa says, if you had the chance to redo your dissertation on Blondel, what would your new subject be? Okay, so that's a great question. My dissertation, looking back on it, and I haven't looked at it for years, is kind of a hot mess. I never actually published more than a little bit of it. I think I was trying to work with too much. I was doing some very big picture philosophy and ideas and history stuff all at once. And I was working with a lot of his untranslated later works, like the trilogy. I think if I were going to, so there's a couple of things. If I was going to write a new dissertation on anybody, it would be a much more manageable, very structured, I'm going to do this, and this, and nothing else outside of this sort of approach. And I suggest that anybody who is working not just on a dissertation, but a master's thesis or even a bachelor's thesis, the advice that one of my advisors gave me is the only good dissertation is a done dissertation. And that is quite true. You've got to pick something that's much more manageable. I've thought many times that what I should have done, instead of writing on Blondel for my dissertation, I should have done that later on, just, for my own stuff, as I did with, my book, the Reason Fulfilled by Revelation, where I translated 4 of Blondel's contributions to the 1930s Christian philosophy debates. And then I wrote a long historical introduction. I should have just written like a dissertation on Anselm and the history of the ontological argument, or, Blondel on this thing over here, or Aristotle on anger, or, any of the other things that I was really quite interested in, but what would have been much more manageable. If I was, let's say because obviously I'm in a different situation now. I don't have the time to write a dissertation, but let's say I did. Let's say somebody gave me a fellowship and they're like, "We want you to do another dissertation on Blondel." I'm like, "Oh, thank you very much." What would I write on now? I mean, I think I would probably discuss. I think the thing I would be the most interested in discussing, quite frankly, would be what the still as yet untranslated metaphysical trilogy, which is 5 volumes, what it contributes, why it's valuable. This guy wrote Axiom 1893. In 1893, that was his doctoral dissertations. Great stuff. He wrote some other, fairly shorter works after that, a lot of things that were both timely and polemical. And then in the 1930s, he began work while he was nearly blind and having to do this by dictation on this metaphysical trilogy. And he's taking his thoughts and sort of like reworking them. That's probably what I would be most interested in focusing on. All right. Arvid Malm, Philosopher Greg, what is your opinion on the overabundance of online pornography these days? Do you think it's harmful for the younger generation? Yes, it's undoubtedly harmful in different ways. And I'm laughing because I have something that I say to my classes sometimes that always gets them laughing. So imagine that a bunch of aliens have been like watching us for centuries, and they're like, "Holy crap! Look at these people! Their technological boom is happening." And then they're like, they've got all this great communication stuff, radio waves, TV. It's no longer just wireless and all that. And then they see us like developing cable and computers and networks of the computers, and boom, we have the internet, right? And they're like, all right, they're finally almost ready to join the United Federation of Worlds, like a civilized species. And then they watch for another couple decades, and then they're like, wow, they're using a lot of their bandwidth for just a couple things. We should look at this more carefully. And then what do they find that we use the majority of our bandwidth for? Well, there's lots of business related stuff, a lot of which is ultimately quite trivial, but massive amounts of porn, massive amounts of gaming. And they'd be like, oh, it's one of those species. And I mean, on the one hand, we know technologically that pornography has driven development in media, like down to like why VHS became more popular than beta, or how all these things were done with the internet. On the other hand, there's lots of downsides, right? And they are all over the map. People get very unrealistic ideas about sexuality from pornography. Gearing towards more and more extreme stuff. It can interfere, sort of like with how you understand what a genuine intimate relationship would be like. Leads to lots of pressure on people to engage in this or that, particularly when they're younger. People become addicted. There's exploitation of the people involved in it. Even if you have like full consent, I would say there's a lot of economic exploitation involved, and we could go on and on and on. And so it's a real problem. There's not much you can actually do about it in terms of like closing the pipe gates, right? That's not going to happen unless you're living literally like under a rock with no internet access. So what do we need instead? We probably need way better sex ed classes earlier on, where people are like, listen, you're probably going to see porn. Here's what you should know about it. Here's why this is not realistic. Here's why you don't want to be watching this, 3-4 hours a day. Here's the signs of being addicted, and that can be tied in with internet addiction as well. We probably need a much more like virtue ethics orientation towards it than the, don't do it. That we know that that's not even useful for like abstinence education. Put porn aside. Abstinence only sex ed actually leads to more STDs and pregnancies typically. So we really, we need to do more when it comes to that. Mickey asks, what is Martin Heidegger's justification for using attunement as a means of metaphysical inquiry? So attunement means mood, right? Bestimmung. And we can call that modes of affectivity. And justification, moods are revelatory. Aristotle actually noted this way back in the Rhetoric book too, they affect the way in which we view things. So I don't think he particularly has to justify that. And actually, he mentions that Aristotle's Rhetoric book 2 is like a primary example of an early hermeneutics of affectivity in Being and Time. Heidegger conceives of our experience as human beings in the world as having 4 what he calls equiprimordial, we can call them dimensions or whatever. And equiprimordial means none of them are more basic than the other. They're all equally basic. And mood or attunement is one of them. Pre-understanding, the projections that we make, every situation we go into, we're bringing to bear the things that we think we know or believe or assume. Thrownness, which is the sort of the present, the situation that we're in, and then language or however you want to translate it. Discourse is how the Stambach translates it, Rede in German, and these all interpenetrate each other. So that's important, and paying attention to emotions. Not just in the sense of mindfulness, like, what are you feeling right now? Let the feeling wash over you and observe it, but actually like genuine metaphysical inquiry into the nature of human emotions and affectivity. That can be extraordinarily revealing. And Heidegger is not the only phenomenologist to realize this. Max Scheler spends a lot of time on this. Gabriel Marcel, who's another contemporary, spends a lot of time on this, as does Bergson, who is not calling what he does phenomenology, but it's really phenomenology. So I think that's part of what the answer to that would be. All right, let's look at the next one. John says, I'm interested in exploring Christianity more. Should I start with the Old Testament or the New Testament, and any recommended sections? You should start by like talking to people who practice that seem to be well put together to you as well. It's not just, it's not as if like the Bible, which by the way is a whole bunch of books, ta Biblia, is simply the foundation, and then everything flows out of that. That's a particularly sort of hyper-Protestant way of looking at it that would actually exclude most Protestants of any sort of tradition, like, say, Lutherans or Anglicans or Presbyterians. You want to engage with people who've been shaped by Christianity, if you want to understand it, as well as, some of the core texts. So I would say, like reading Augustine's Confessions can be just as useful for you as reading, the Book of Judges. If you want a challenging book, by the way, that's a tough one, right? Christianity, the New Testament is going to be much more normative, but there's a lot of things that are carried forward. Every time you see in the New Testament, it is written that's a citation of Scripture. So Christ, for example, is in the synagogue, and he's unrolling a scroll, and it's Isaiah, and he's reading it and interpreting it for people. So they kind of go hand in hand. There are parts of the Old Testament that I would say are probably not that particularly interesting or worth reading at first, like a lot of the historical books or some of the minor prophets. If you're philosophically inclined, you want to read the wisdom literature, which would include things like Ecclesiastes or Koleth, right, the prophet talking about that, Song of Songs, the Psalms, Proverbs, Wisdom of Sirach, Book of Wisdom of Solomon. Those are all kind of heavy hitters. Some of them are not in the Protestant canon, but they're in the Catholic and Orthodox and Ethiopian, Coptic, or all the older early churches that are apostolic contain them. The New Testament, the Gospels are. I mean, if you want to know what this Jesus guy was like, you probably want to read the Gospels because that's people talking about the guy, right? If you're going to read Paul's letters, you should also read Peter, James, and these other letter writers who are equally normative but not as quite as prolific. Jude too. So, but I would say you also want to if you're going to read it, maybe you read it with other people who are grounded in it. So, all right, Made of Clay. I'm just beginning to learn about a division between analytic and continental philosophy, and was curious if universities focus on one more than the other or regard one as more important. Oh, yeah, definitely. Not universities, programs in universities. So if you go to some places, it may be that they have a few people not just doing analytic philosophy, but almost everybody's doing analytic, whereas other places, it can be mostly continentals. But those are only two of many different ways and traditions of doing philosophy, and they're both pretty recent. There's the entire field of history of philosophy, which includes everything from studying the history for its own sake to philosophy as a way of life, like Pierre Hadot or John Sellers kind of stuff, and everything in between. There's classical American philosophy, which isn't just pragmatism, but also includes Jonathan Edwards and the St. Louis Hegelians and the Transcendentalists and all sorts of people today. There's Marxism as a tradition. There's all sorts of radical philosophies available as well that don't fit neatly into continental or analytic and are often part of the great sequence of American philosophy. We can talk about Africana philosophy that kind of overlaps with that as well, and which would include people in the Americas as well as people in Africa, right? And so there's all sorts of different. Well, and then there's comparative philosophy, right? We haven't even talked about Chinese and Indian philosophy, but there are people who specialize in talking about Aristotle in comparison to the Confucian tradition. So there's all these different things, and I think people often get very bogged down in thinking, "Oh, I've got to be on team this or team that," and really, this isn't an answer to the question, but I'm going to say this just as something I think needs to be reinforced. It's your life and your brain and your reading and your study and your time. So you get to do whatever the hell you want with it. Even if you're like a graduate student at a place that's super into analytic philosophy and denigrates everything else, there's no reason why you have to buy into that and you can't go home and read some Nietzsche, or read Simone de Beauvoir if you want to, or, read whoever you like, right? You can read things that don't count as philosophy that people will say that's just literature, right? It's your life. You can do what you want with it, and you don't have to necessarily get into anybody's program about how philosophy has to be done. The older you get and the more that you travel around, the more that you find that these you have to do things this way, this way, this way, turn out to be all bullshit, and wishful thinking, on the part of the people putting them together. All right, Govind says, what's my thoughts on Korbinski's work, Science and Sanity on General Semantics Overall? Does it have any value? So there's another tradition, right, in philosophy, and another area where philosophy bleeds over into other disciplines like linguistics. I think it's good. And I'm trying to remember, there's another guy associated with that who I think was a student of Korbinski, Hayakawa. Does that sound right to anybody who's and their books are good. They've got their shtick, right? And it's interesting because somebody who I like very much as an author, as a science fiction author, really got into that stuff, and that's A. Van Vogt, who has a Institute for General Semantics existing in the future in the world of null A. He was so impressed with that. I don't think that they have the like monopoly on intelligent discussion of language, but I think the stuff that they did was quite interesting. All right, JB says, I've just started I.F. Stone's The Trial of Socrates. What's your take on the hot take that Socrates was actually an anti-democratic aristocrat? Okay, so that's an interesting take. I do not think that he was an aristocrat. I would say that he was definitely a critic of democracy, but he also he was a. This is where we get into really interesting stuff that you have a broader implications. Socrates is sort of a good example of somebody who takes virtue very seriously. And if you are not necessarily virtuous, but at least taking virtue seriously, you are going to have a hard time buying into a lot of existing political movements and associations. And so democracy, there's problems with that. Oligarchy, which aristocracies typically tend to be, problems with that. Tyranny, problems with that. Socrates diagnoses all of them. As a matter of fact, when people talk about Plato and, well, what about Plato's Republic? It's very important to remember that in Book 2, Socrates actually defines what the ideal city is, and it's not the ideal city of Book 2 on through Book 7, is it? Because that's actually, what's the ideal city? It's this place where, we got a shoemaker and a farmer, maybe a couple farmers and a builder, and I forget who else we have, and they subside on pretty simple food. And then Glaucon comes along and says, Socrates, this life sucks. They don't have relish for their meat. And Socrates says, oh, I know, I understand. You don't want the perfect city. You want the inflamed city. And that's what we see represented in the Republic, right? It's not the best or Plato's model or something like that. Socrates is a problematizer. So, a critic of democracy, yeah. An aristocrat, only in the sense that, he would be for an aristocracy that doesn't exist, an aristocracy of the, aristoi, the genuinely virtuous people. Aristotle, by the way, is hip to that as well in the Politics towards the end. I think this is in Book 6, Book 7. I don't quite remember exactly where. When he's talking about what you need in a city, he says, you're going to have the many, and they represent certain interests, and you're going to have the rich, and you can't get away from that. And they're both kind of steering things towards democracy or oligarchy. If you want things to go right, you also need the aristoi, the good, the people who keep things together and don't buy into these class things that both are willing to corrupt society for. And you're never going to have the aristoi actually being the whole of the place or ruling most of the time, but they need to be there at the table, or else you're going to have some real problems. So. All right, so here's a question from Elijah. Did I ever hear of the philosopher Jacques Ellul? I've not only heard of him, I've read some of his stuff a long time ago. Interesting, as far as I remember. I haven't taken a look at him lately, but he is, an important philosopher of technology. Another area I don't do a lot of work in, but would enjoy doing some work in. I think if I had the time, I wish I had more time. I was talking with somebody about this yesterday, and I used it as an example. What would I want if I could have it? Every day to be 48 hours. That would be awesome, wouldn't it? So, all right. Let's take a look at the next one. Ruben, in what order should I read Kant, his major 5 books? Also, should I focus on interpretations and critics before or after reading a text, even if both is best? You don't have to read them in any particular order. I say this every time. Whatever order you pick, you're going to be rereading. So it's not like first you get this down and then you get this down. I mean, the before you read the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason, you might want to read the thing that Kant calls the Prolegomena, to be read beforehand, right? So that's important. The second critique is an way easier read, at least for me, and it's shorter too, than the first critique. And you probably want to read the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals before that. And then there is also the actual like metaphysics of morals, which has two parts: virtue, justice. That's definitely worth reading. I find the moral philosophy, easier to make your way through than the epistemology stuff. The Critique of Judgment is, wow, that's like all sorts of things jumbled up together. And I think a lot of people never go on to read that when they're reading Kant. And then he's got all sorts of like little essays here and there that are worth checking out. But you're going to be like going back and forth. And do you want to use secondary sources? Sure. You can use whatever you like. Just realize that every secondary source is a secondary source, And same thing goes for my videos. People, I had an exchange just this week with somebody who was like talking about Camus, right? And they were going by what was in my video, which are not the whole work. And they had to do something with the absurd, and I was like, you got to read the text. There's no way around that. You have to read the text, but that doesn't mean you have to read the text all the way through every single time. With Kant's first critique, that is a significant investment, and it's worth reading through and understanding, just like so many other philosophical works. But you probably could also get by with some good summaries as well. William Vanderberg, do I have any experience with psychedelics, in specific LSD or acid? No, I've never taken that sort of stuff. The only things that I've had is, when I was undergrad and grad student, plenty of drinking. Actually, when I was in the Army too, in high school. And, when I was in grad school, Carbondale, Illinois, it was a heavy pot area. So I smoked a bit, but I didn't enjoy it very much. Mostly because I don't like hanging around potheads that much. And what else? Tried ecstasy once, but I was drunk and high at the time, so I don't know if it meant anything. And I got dosed with PCP by somebody who laced some stuff with it, and that was not pleasant at all. But that's about it. And I'm not one of these like open the third eye, open the doors of consciousness kind of person when it comes to psychedelics. So yeah. All right. Plato's Rave. Any thoughts on Nick Land and the CCRU? I don't really pay attention to Nick Land. People used to ask me about him all the time. Now not so much. I've over and over again said, if somebody actually wants to put a book copy of Fang Noumena in my hands, I will read it and comment on it. But nobody's done that so far. So. Keith says, are you familiar with the Rejig-Putnam argument that special relativity implies a deterministic block universe? What are your favorite works on the question of free will? I am not familiar with that, but I don't pay much attention, to that sort of stuff myself. Favorite works on free will? There's all sorts of great works out there where it's a topic. It comes up in Descartes' Metaphysics. Obviously, the whole Cartesian tradition. There's a lot of discussion of it. There's a lot of discussion of it in medieval philosophy, including in Aquinas and Anselm and Augustine and Boethius. And I mean, there's like an entire vast literature out there on the issue of free will. But the thing that you always have to be wary of is there's no such thing as the question of free will. There's just a whole bunch of different discussions, and they don't always mean the same thing by free will. So you always got to look carefully at what's actually being said there. Pointsman, any suggestions for getting into Stoic logic and metaphysics? Well, yeah, so we don't have any works of Stoic logic per se. Like we know that, say Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus and other people were able to read, and Epictetus probably taught. Chrysippus, you look at in Diogenes Laertius, the catalog of his works, and most of them were logical works. So you can get like rudiments of it here and there, but we don't have a single work for Stoic logic. Somebody might have compiled all the fragments together into some text. I actually have a project that I'm interested in working on, just bringing together all the syllogistic arguments that we find in the works, and then talking about them and unpacking them, because the Stoics love to argue using syllogisms so much that Cicero actually said that you guys were way too far with that. Now the metaphysics. Okay, so there's, some of the letters of Seneca bear directly on metaphysics. So I would read some of the, letters, particularly, for example, letter 65. You see little bits and pieces here in Marcus. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations is not a systematic work at all, but you see him saying things that are reflective of it. Same thing you can say in certain parts of Epictetus. But I think for a lot of this, you want to go to Cicero, who's not a Stoic but knows the Stoics very well. So if you want to understand their theology, on the nature of the gods, that's the place to go. If you want to understand their ideas about freedom and determinism, on fate is an important one. On divination as well is important. So all right, MF. Have I read any of Paulo B. Preciando's books criticizing Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis? I've never even heard of the guy, so no. Skin in the academic game. I've noticed some scientists and mathematicians might explicitly adhere to idealism. Is this the case? It seems that the positivism of Comte is based on pure ideas rather than material reality. I wouldn't know about that with Comte, but that seems rather suspect to me. There are some mathematicians who, in the philosophy of mathematics, we don't call it idealism, we call it Platonism, who think that mathematical objects have real existence of their own, independent of, whatever we're doing with mathematics. I don't know about scientists per se. I know more about mathematicians, but yeah, they're out there, I guess. Mark says, "How's it going? Hope you're keeping well." Yeah, I'm doing okay. I actually gave my students a week to catch up, because some of them are not doing okay. I put that into the semester, but I'm doing good on my end. I hope you are too. Truth to power. Were there any philosophers that believed in promoted social chaos? I'm writing a fictional work and would love to flesh out a certain character. Promoted social chaos. Some people would say that Nietzsche was, right? Lev Shestov certainly, thought that things are a lot messier. You could talk about people like saying, I'm not just going to like stir the pot and make everything chaotic, but rather I'm going to recognize that things are not as well laid out as you think. The character in Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground is kind of a pot stirrer that way, right? So there's people out there. I don't know about any who's like, I love chaos and we should have more of it, because it's a bit of a self-defeating thing. If you're going to go through all the work to get published, how chaotic are you? All right, T. Maggio, your lectures on Sartre and Marx have been really helpful, and I'm curious, what do you think about the proposition that Marx was a proto-existentialist? Well, anybody can be a proto-existentialist, depending on what you mean by existentialism, right? If it's about like focusing on lived reality and practicalities, yeah, Marx can fit in there, I guess. Certainly a lot of existentialists drew on Marx, although some of them hated his guts, or hated his followers' guts, So, he and Kierkegaard were in the same classroom at certain times, but didn't really know each other. But I don't know what's actually gained by viewing Marx as a proto-existentialist. I think that's the question you've got to ask. What would that tell us? I mean, we can also say Pascal's a proto-existentialist, or Augustine is. How is what Marx is doing different than what they're doing, right? All right, Gabriel, which ancient philosopher would you be most interested in having a conversation with? That's a good question. I mean, probably Cicero. You know, I'm a big fan of his. He'd probably, I don't know if he'd enjoy hanging out with me though. But yeah, he's probably the one. All right, Colamus, do you think Plato's earlier dialogues are underappreciated and or underutilized? Nah, I mean they get taught, they get read, they get discussed, they get drawn upon. They often don't arrive at the full exposition of the matter that they were supposed to be about. So, like a good example, the Laches. Do we really know what courage is? We thought we did at the start, but now it turns out that it's murkier. Well, we've learned some things along the way. I mean, I would say Plato's dialogues as such are underutilized and underappreciated in philosophy in general, especially by people who like to say, "Oh, philosophy is just a set of footnotes to Plato," and then you're like, "Oh, that's cool. Which dialogues do you like?" And they're like, "Hamana, hamana, hamana." Right? They don't have any answer because they just have this one little quip. I think reading Plato is quite important and should be part of everybody's undergraduate education. Not to become a Platonist as such, but because it's worth doing it. Tullius, you speak about the importance of making good distinctions. What are some distinctions you've found in your life to be most important or fruitful? What distinctions do we find we fail to make? So, I mean, the Stoics are totally right about there is a distinction between the judgment that you have been affected in this way and actually being affected in that way. That's something they drive home all the time. A lot of distinctions that I find I make with other people that they find quite helpful usually are like, hey, that word has more than one use. Very simple stuff, right? You're talking about this, they're talking about this. Distinguishing between means and ends and different means, distinguishing between what question we're actually discussing at the time is very important. Keeping questions separated out from each other, because people will often, and this happens a lot in political discussions, they'll be like, yeah, but what about? And then you're like, that's a legitimate question. That has nothing to do with this over here. And so, you got to make a case for how that has to do with this over here. Those are examples. All right. Edwin Boyette says, thoroughly appreciate the self-study lectures. I need to do more of them, hopefully this summer. What was your MOS in the Army? So I was a 12 Bravo, which means I was a combat engineer. And which, basically, for those of you who don't know, that means you're essentially like infantry, but with less of the, sort of squad and platoon weapons, and kind of bumped up in terms of dealing with traditional engineer stuff. So minefields, obstacles like concertina wire stuff, building bridges, although we didn't do any of that in Germany, thank God, because I hated building bridges. Destroying obstacles, demolition, all that sort of stuff falls under the engineer's purview. But they could be like brought in to be used as infantry. And within an engineer squad, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what it's like today, but within an engineer squad, which was not the 11-man infantry squad, but was 6 to 8 people, you'd have 2 people with M203s. That's grenade launchers. I carried one of those on my rifle, and then one person with like an anti-tank weapon. So you're kind of like you're beefed up a bit, but you don't have like the automatic weapons that everybody else does. In part because I guess if we were not, we were mechanized, so we had these armored personnel carriers, which were actually like Vietnam vintage M113s, just filled to the gills with crap, all sorts of tools that we'd never use and we had to know. They even had a trailer in the back that we'd like have to bring all this crap along with us. So engineers are sort of like the jack of all trades. And in wartime, our life expectancy was very, very short because we would probably be detached, and each squad would go with like an infantry company or an armor company, and we would go out in front of them and like clear obstacles, which means everybody would be shooting at us and trying to kill us while that's happening. So it was kind of an interesting thing to do. So, all right. Nominus says, who's your favorite philosopher to read who you mostly disagree with? That's yeah. I bet it is Descartes. I would say. I'm not a Cartesian, but I really love reading and teaching Descartes, and it's interesting stuff. Hume would be up there as well, and so would Nietzsche. All of them would fit in there pretty well. A1 says, "Go Badgers." I am from Wisconsin. I don't actually care about the Badgers. My mom and dad did. My adopted mom and dad, because they were both. My dad went to University of Wisconsin Madison, and so they picked up a thing for that. But he died when I was 11, and I never got into the Go Badgers thing. I'm a Packers fan, and I do like our sort of second tier AHL hockey team, the Admirals, but that's about it for me. I don't pay much attention to other sports, which is unfortunate because right now the Brewers and the Bucks are pretty good teams. But all right, let's see here. Chris says, my work requires facilitating communication between specialists from different fields. What's the most effective way to improve your skills in conceptual analysis through self-study? I don't know, but that having to work with different fields, that's quite good. I mean, I would say, studying human communications, there is like a field out there, but it's sort of a hybrid thing that incorporates some philosophy and some linguistics and some psychology, and they blend it all together. And sometimes it's a good combo, sometimes not. I would say that's probably helpful. All right. Tullius, any religious thinkers that interacted seriously with the work of Heidegger who you'd recommend? That's a good question, but I don't think I have a good answer. I mean, first of all, I'm not like all that conversant with the field of people who did that. And then ones to recommend, like I could talk about Boltzmann, but I mean, it's not going to hurt you to read Boltzmann, but I didn't find Boltzmann particularly illuminating. So I don't know. Skip says, how much is anxiety tied to holding fast to expectations that are unrealistic? Well, that's a good question. I would say sometimes it is. And this is where the Stoics, I think, are particularly helpful, but existential analysis can be helpful too. If you think that things have to be a certain way, and if they aren't that way, that everybody's going to hate you, or the world is going to fall apart, or stuff like that, well, that's going to make you anxious as hell, because any given real thing almost never turns out the way that we imagine it's going to, right? So, great example of this is like event planning, right? If you're an event planner and you're not able to roll with things not happening exactly the way that you've planned them out, man, that's going to suck for you. You're going to be anxious all the time, or angry, or disappointed, or whatever. The same thing can go for like classes. Professors can like, I'm going to develop the syllabus and it's all these wonderful things are going to happen. And then the students come in and they do things very differently the way you want. And the technology doesn't work properly. And now you can become quite anxious, right? So, all right. A1 says, have I seen the Snyder Cut? No, I don't really get into superhero stuff. That's what I understand the Snyder Cut is about. I kind of steer clear of that. Although I will say that I have been, my wife and I both have been very much enjoying the show The Boys, which is quite good, quite well done. We'll see what they do with season 3 because we just finished season 2. But I don't spend much time. I think part of what originally turned me off of superhero movies was how Marvel managed to screw up the X-Men early on, and like went for easy sort of the thing that like you're like, yeah, this is the sort of thing like a sophomore film student would like totally geek out over, but it's not a good production overall for somebody who actually cares about it. And so I just don't get into it. I mean, life is short. I got other stuff that I do get into, like this. We're going to be talking about this in 2 months, or David Hume, or things like that. So. All right, Damon says the Day After TV show terrified me as a kid. So yeah, that's a great example. I think that was in the early 80s, right? Not the 70s. And what we're talking about there is a made-for-TV movie that had 2 parts to it. And it was like, we and the Soviets went to war, and they dropped some nuclear weapons in America, which produced fallout and radiation poisoning and, all sorts of misery. We watched that and we're like, holy crap, that could happen. We were pretty worried at the time. I think a lot of people don't get that, how close we were. Orville, thoughts on dialectical materialism? It depends on who's you're talking about. I don't really have a lot of thoughts on it as such. Sayed says, thanks for all the videos. Is there any particular philosophical subject or specific philosophical question that particularly interests me? I'm kind of all over the map. I have a lot of different interests, which makes it difficult for me to get things done or get them done on time. The question of like causality, determinism, freedom of the will. I don't talk much about free will, but freedom of the will and what the will is, that's something I'm very interested in. Where we're going as a human species and culture, I'm very interested in that. Obviously, I'm interested in ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy and early modern stuff. How to apply philosophy to people's life issues, that's a big preoccupation of mine as well. So, all right. Wavy, you're well versed in the teachings of multiple philosophers from multiple time periods. How do you keep track of each philosopher's teachings and the scholarly thought on their work? I don't. I don't read a lot of secondary literature unless I'm doing work on something. Usually academic stuff. I don't need to. I can read Hegel. I don't need to read what everybody else is saying about Hegel. Life is short, and I'd rather stick with the primary texts. That said, if I'm going to write a piece on Hegel, and it's on this particular stuff, I read up on the secondary lit, but I don't necessarily like exhaustively do that as if I was writing a new dissertation. So the answer is I don't, because you can't. I do enjoy reading what intelligent people have to say about thinkers who I like, but that's often just not in the cards, right? Brandon says, big question. I'm wondering how you think knowledge, total knowledge specifically, or encyclopediasm is different during the first half of the 20th century than in the 18th or 19th centuries. Was Hegel the last viable attempt to bring all knowledge into unity? Nobody's brought all knowledge into unity. Nobody's ever in the history of things been really encyclopedic in that sense. They've been at best semi-encyclopedic. And everybody is going to do it from some sort of guiding perspective. So the thing that's really interesting is we don't have to have that in order to be able to talk about important things and make well-guided decisions. We don't have to know the totality of things. And I think Hegel did himself a disservice in trying to claim that sort of like epistemological closure on his part that he didn't attain and couldn't have, as like required to be able to say the things that he says. So I just don't see that as a viable project. Here's one from about heavy metal. The Aldevar, favorite heavy metal band now versus when you were in your 20s. So when I was in my 20s, I was listening to less and less metal, actually, as time went on. And I was listening more to stuff that was like coming out, but was in like the grunge to metal spectrum. And I'll qualify that. So, when I went to college in 1990, I brought a bunch of metal tapes with me, and I was playing bass, and I was, playing a lot of Iron Maiden and Black Sabbath and Judas Priest and Motorhead stuff on my bass, But I was also like, on Metallica, first three albums, I like had the song sheets for that, and I learned every song they had. But I started getting more into the grunge stuff and listening to less of that, and also listening to bands that were kind of on the edge of those, both like Alice in Chains, and I picked up other bands like Tool along the way. It'd be better to talk about like in my teens. When I was in my teens, the band for me as a metalhead was Iron Maiden. They were like at the pinnacle, right? And then every other band was arranged below them. So you could say like, well, who's your second favorite? Motorhead and Wasp and Judas Priest and Raven and Rat, Dio, and then we could start going further down. And now I don't have a favorite. There are a lot of bands from that time period who I really like. And if I had to put together like my top 5, Iron Maiden would still be in there, as would Judas Priest and Motorhead. And Dio would be in there as well. And then, who would be the 5th? Maybe, just if I consider like their entire catalog, Black Sabbath. But that's not just Ozzy Black Sabbath, that's Dio Black Sabbath, that's Gillan Black Sabbath, that's Martin Black Sabbath. But there's so many other bands that I really like Tank or Girl School, or Riot from New York, not to be confused with Quiet Riot, or all these other bands that I've gotten exposed to over time, who turn out to be really awesome, that I didn't even know about when I was younger. So yeah, there's a lot more. So here's a silly question from Feels Okay. Have I heard of Eastern Orthodoxy? I started out teaching religious studies when I had my first main teaching job, and obviously taught about Eastern Orthodoxy then, and that was almost 20 years ago. And I'd known about that really since I was in my teens. So yeah. All right. So Mark asks, what are some of your favorite songs to jam to on your bass or banjo? That's a great question. So a lot of them are metal songs, strangely enough. Some of them I'm not as good at as I'd like to be, because I don't practice like I should. But with Judas Priest, I like to play Desert Plains and Green Manalishi with Two-Pronged Crown. Motorhead, I like to play Killed by Death, No Class. I'm blanking on it. It's off of Orgasmatron. It's the one about fighting, sword and steel. What is it? Rictus Grin. Death Forever. I play that. Scorpion songs, I like quite a few of those. I play some UFO songs. I play some other stuff, and then there's some rock stuff. I actually Kiss too. I play some Kiss songs on my banjo. But there's other bands too whose stuff I like. I've actually got like my I print out chords for myself, and then adapt it to the banjo. So I've got my whole. I need to fix this binder. It's all messed up. But these are some examples of the stuff. Oh yeah, like Gordon Lightfoot. I like to play his stuff. Quite a few of his songs. Play some Coldplay songs. Here's some Alice in Chains stuff and Wasp. Neil Young. I could go on and on and on. Oh, here's an Alice Cooper, right? 17. There's 18, I like to play some Duran Duran stuff as well, quite a bit. Oh wow, here's an actual here's a Portuguese fados song that I used to play, Maria se foras ao baile. So it's pretty eclectic. You know, um, my wife's absolute favorite song, and I actually do play a lot of songs by this band, is Cracker, and she likes me to play "I Want Everything," and every once in a while I do that as something sort of nice to do. It's a pretty straightforward, simple song. There's only four chords in it, but it's good. So yeah, a lot of different things, I'd say. All right, back to other questions. Dylan, what philosopher do you think got closest to proving God or had the most interesting things to say about, and the metaphysics that would have to be there for God to be a reality? I don't think anyone got closest to proving God. Either find some path. We have to think about, what does proof mean? Convinces every other human being in the universe to go along with it, or provides a path that a rational person lacking impediments could follow. I mean, I'm a big fan of Anselm. I think a lot of people don't read the actual text, and they reconstruct the ontological argument, which Anselm never calls ontological, by the way. And by the way, the argument in Proslogion is not just about God existing or having being, but about being the supreme good and all the other things we believe about God. I think Anselm's stuff is very interesting. I waver back and forth the way other people have with the argument, but it's got an interesting architecture to it. So, all right. Alternative, it seems like many humans enjoy believing and imagining things that either don't exist or that are extremely hard and impossible for their existence to be proven. How do you justify this tendency? Could it be a human need, or could it be based on some kind of intuition? I would say neither. I would say that, it could be based in human needs, plural, that come together in certain ways. But it also has to do with the fact that we have language that can refer to itself, and we have the capacity to engage in imagination, and we are social beings, and we exist in histories and with traditions, so we can pick up other people's ideas. We're not all reinventing it as we go along. I think all of those fit into it, and I think the idea, the focus on their existence to be proven, is usually the wrong way to go. It's there's so much focus on that among philosophers and people who are philosophy adjacent, and there's not enough on like exploring what the ideas actually are and what they would mean. So a lot of times people, this can't be proven. Oh, okay. That often means you don't buy it, or somebody else isn't into it. But what's the actual idea? And then you ask them, and their engagement with it is so thin. It's nice sometimes to kick around ideas, even if we don't buy into them entirely. All right. Peren says, Socrates mocked Anaxagoras, who stated the sun and moon were only material substances, not gods. Was he the equivalent to a flat earther, or was all this an attempt to not appear atheist? I wouldn't say either. I would say it was mocking. I wouldn't read too much into that. Airtius, what do you recommend to read if I enjoy Nietzsche's philosophy? So I'm assuming that means you've already read Nietzsche. I don't know. Read the people. There's so many people who are influenced by Nietzsche, right? That you could follow them out. Max Scheler has a wonderful little book on Resentiment. Rainer Maria Rilke got introduced to Nietzsche by his lover, Lou Andreas Salome, who had traveled with Nietzsche and who wrote a book on Nietzsche. There's lots and lots of people that you could look at who were influenced, and then you can see, you can probably read a little bit and be like, this isn't for me, but some of them you might find to be interesting interlocutors with Nietzsche, or interpreters of Nietzsche. All right. James, some argue that Kantian deontology is too demanding, but couldn't we say similar about virtue ethics? It seems tough to develop moral character in this world, or am I missing something? Yeah, you're missing the fact that just because something is difficult doesn't mean you should give it up. I mean, if you want to be a Kantian deontologist, live as a deontologist. See if you can do it. If you want to be a virtue ethicist, live as a virtue ethicist. See if you can make progress in virtue. It's sort of like starting at the very beginning of something and being like, nah, I can only see 5 yards into this building, but I think it's not for me, even though the building goes on for a mile. You know, I think a lot of these, oh, it's too difficult to do things are basically people wanting to make it easy for themselves. Um, I mean, you could say the same thing about Stoic ethics, and the response to that, Epictetus says, is be the purple thread, you know, in the white garment. Um, so what if everybody can't do it? Doesn't mean you can't do it, right? The inverted form. I'm almost done reading the Phenomenology with a reading group. I'm very proud. This is one I've been intimidated by for a long time. What's a good follow-up? Reading the Phenomenology again, and seeing how much more you get out of it the next time. I mean, if you follow Hegel's own thing, you're supposed to read The Science of Logic next. That's a real head cracker. I don't know how much you'll actually get out of it. You could, like read The Philosophy of Right or any of his lectures. He's got lots of great lecture stuff. Lectures on the philosophy of history, lectures on the history of philosophy, lectures on aesthetics, lectures on the philosophy of religion. We could go on and on. It's really up to you. But the next time you do read the Phenomenology, you will find that you're seeing stuff that you missed the last time around. All right. John asked me about a text I haven't read. Jung's Wotan essay. I haven't read it. Haven't read Peter Sloterdijk. Have I read Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed? No, I haven't read any of those things. Wavy. What's the process of translating non-English language works of philosophy into English? Are some languages harder to translate than others? The process is you translate it. There's no like process to it. You just translate and then check your translation and have somebody else check your translation and fix what went wrong in it. It's I don't know what you mean by a process. All right, Singularity. I want to say congratulations on reaching 100,000. I just skipped a little bit. Boy, a lot of questions here, more than I'm going to actually get to, unfortunately. Here we go. It's a tremendous accomplishment considering the content rigor, depth of your videos, inspiration for those seeking to do the same. Thanks. That's really great. So yeah, it's been a while. We're gonna have a party tomorrow. Another one of these events. I'm going to talk a little bit about that process then, and so let me jump on to the next one. DD, don't Jews consider the Talmud the Old Testament? Well, that's not the same thing. So the Talmud is commentary. You mean Torah, right? To be metaphors, oral history, life lessons. In other words, they don't take it literally like Christians tend to do. Depends on which Jewish people you're talking to. There's a wide variety. Some do take it completely literally, others don't. So I wouldn't try to generalize. All right, I'm going to skip down a bit to things that are a bit easier to get. Damn it, Albert. Dr. Sadler, you seem to despise intro level of history of philosophy, overview sorts of things, but you know of any ones you might recommend? I don't despise them. I put them in their proper context. They're not the original text. And many of them are actually wrong. So if you think that's despising, I think that's more about what you're reading into it than what I actually think. Primary texts are primary texts. Secondary texts are secondary texts. Some secondary texts are so good they become primary texts. Like, when Heidegger is talking about what's going on in Nietzsche, that's basically like a in between primary and secondary text. A lot of other people's stuff on Nietzsche is not worth your time. So yeah, any ones I might recommend? Yeah, I always say, if you really want a history of philosophy, Friedrich Kobelston. He's got a history of philosophy. He's not going to steer you wrong. He's definitely not going to give you everything that's there in the text, but it's decent stuff. All right. Carlos says, I want to read Edmund Husserl. What do you recommend me? When I teach Husserl, I have my students read the Cartesian Meditations and Husserl's own article, encyclopedia article on phenomenology, because you get him explaining what what he takes phenomenology to be doing, right? So, all right, Novan, what do you think about Heidegger's criticism of Sartre's existentialism? What's the critical difference between existentialism and metaphysics? There isn't a critical difference between existentialism and metaphysics. Metaphysics, often gets done in an existentialist way. Um, Heidegger's criticism of Sartre's existentialism was that Sartre is misinterpreting some of the things that Heidegger is saying, and he's much too humanistic about it. I would say these are two different kinds of existentialism, Um, Plato's Rave says, time to get you a copy of Fang Noumena then. Well, if you do that, I'll be very grateful, and I'll do a review of it. All right, let's see. I'm going to skip down a little bit. Questions that we're going to get more mileage out of, right? So Hey Doc, thoughts on Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, and the whole idea that he's been out there for quite a while. I've actually read him quite a bit in the past, and I see a lot of these, whatever you want to call them, neo-reactionaries, traditionalists of sorts, is not, they're engaging with new content, but they're often just doing the same stuff as traditionalists or neo-reactionaries did in, after the French Revolution or with Action Française in the 20th century. I don't see a lot of originality of analysis there. It's often interesting to read because you can get a pulse on where people are going with this stuff, but yeah, sort of like reading Charles Marat. All right, TWOL, I'm doing research that's based on philosophy of solitude. Any suggestions concerning existentialist philosophers who have connections to this philosophy? I don't know about a philosophy of solitude. That sounds like something that somebody made up to try to like corner a little bit of the market themselves, the way people often do. There's philosophy that engages with solitude. And so there's like a long tradition in German philosophy of talking about Einsamkeit. So Rilke thematizes that in Letters to a Young Poet, and actually in several different poems. Nietzsche talks about, the solitary person. For example, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, there's an entire chapter, right? So, the existentialists, they won't always use that term solitude, so you got to do a bit of connecting the dots. Gabriel Marcel talks about those sorts of things. Sartre talks about those sorts of things. De Beauvoir talks about those sort of things. I think you can read through, Lev Shestov too. You can read through the existentialist spectrum and get a lot out of that. Stoics talk about it. Epictetus actually has a whole chapter devoted to it. There's a lot of discussions of solitariness in the monastic literature. In late antiquity, going into the Middle Ages, so that might be quite useful as well. All right, let's see here. Let's see. Wolf seeking truth. Why are so many leftist wisdom seekers when wokeism and wisdom are incompatible? How would you know that? That's a pretty sweeping philosophical statement. I mean, first off, you have to be able to define what wokeism means, and then that better conform to what other people mean by it. But those aren't incompatible any more than being anti-woke is incompatible with wisdom now, is it? Or being somebody to use jargon like that is incompatible with wisdom. Carl Alberding, how would you define philosophy? I wouldn't define philosophy. It's a mistake to try to define philosophy. At best, you can arrive at a definition later on after doing stuff. Wolf says, could you tell us about your personal experience in the academic world as a professor of philosophy nowadays? How it's changed over time? Oh yeah, it's gone from something, so the good old days were before I became a professor. And that was the people who taught us. They remembered that when there was plenty of money flowing around and jobs were easy to find, and being a professor often didn't mean a lot of oversight, or, it was kind of a nice life for many people. And that's when, most of the teaching was actually done by professors and not adjuncts. Throughout my entire career, that has not been the case. My first teaching job was a year-to-year contract where I couldn't get tenure or promotion just because of the way things were set up. Teaching in a maximum security prison, full-time, and then I went down to a struggling HBCU where I actually was up for early tenure and promotion, and then left so I could be together with my now wife up in New York. Since then I've adjuncted, and I got to see, how, I mean, I've been kind of fortunate in the way that adjuncting has worked out for me, especially in the last few years, where I get more requests to teach than I can actually fill because I've got like 20 years experience, and people know me. But it's brutal. The publish or perish thing, it's been ramped up. The telling people they need to have publications before they graduate to even be like considered for jobs. The precarity of academic positions, even if you get tenure. One of the places that I teach phased out 15 departments in their college, and that meant they were allowed to fire those professors, and then some of them were hired back as adjuncts. It's a tough gig, and the people who are doing well at it are usually the ones in the elite institutions who have great pedigrees and are part of a self-replicating elite, and they have no idea what it's like for everybody else, and they're usually the ones who have the bully pulpits. So like for example, the whole Cornell West not getting tenure at Harvard thing, that is so far removed from the experience of most academics that frankly they probably, it's sort of like watching TV shows about people struggling in some sci-fi universe compared to their own real experience. So it's gotten very tough for many people in the academic fields. So, all right, Mark asks if I'd ever taken the ferry from Manitowoc to Ludington across Lake Michigan. I've never taken the ferry, period, which I think you can catch in Milwaukee. There's no reason I would drive up to, I mean, Manitowoc, wouldn't it be Green Bay? I don't know how far up it goes, but all right, we've got about 9 minutes left, so I'm going to pick some questions that are easy to grapple with. I apologize to those I can't get to. Let's see what we got here. So here's a good question. What do you think about promoting philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, Heidegger, who are on record saying sexist, racist, generally exclusionary statements? Surely you should condemn them. You can condemn the statements. It doesn't mean you have to condemn the philosophers. And oftentimes you use the resources of those philosophers to say, Aristotle said this boneheaded thing, he should have said this, and there's resources in that. This sweeping, we must condemn, I think that's a sort of foolish way to go about things. And it doesn't, what do we have left over then, all right, let's see here. Zebra Standards, do you think phenomenology is something which has stopped developing and is just a historical study? Or do you see interesting developments in phenomenology by contemporary thinking? There's a lot of people doing phenomenology. There's a vast movement out there that you can easily Google, and there are people still doing quite interesting work in phenomenology. Oftentimes it's informed by previous thinkers, right? And it'll be done like, if you go to the North American Shaler Society, some of the stuff will be like, this is, what Shaler's talking about here. And then it'll be like, here's how Shaler applies to disability, or, here's what Shaler would have to say, a Shalerian perspective on current political debate, And so there's a lot of quite vital stuff going on, I would say. There's Bruce. Hey, Bruce, good to see you here. Here's a great question. What's my thoughts on the potential ecological crisis we're heading for? Yeah, it's potential only in the sense that like we do have the potential to like maybe veer away from it and mitigate some of the effects. We're screwed if we don't get our act together. And we do have the capacity that we've attained within the last roughly 100 or so years to really, really damage and screw up this planet, and we kind of have to get our shit together, um, and figure out what we're going to do to keep things from really going off kilter. So I don't know that we have the political chops these days to do that, unfortunately. Um, all right, let's see what else we got here. Moxat, what are the differences between Stoics and Spinoza in regards to conception of God? Well, the Stoics don't conceive of God as just one single substance that has two attributes that we can understand, but infinite attributes. It's different cosmologies. So, you know, that's a big part. Gustav, what's your take on capital punishment? I'm not against capital punishment per se. I think that the way that we administer it here in America, and I can really only talk about here, is pretty racist and classist and really poorly guided. And very often we execute people 20 years after they've been convicted and have gone through all these appeals and are quite often different people. There are, interestingly, when I taught at Indiana State Prison, that was the prison where executions were carried out in Indiana at the time. Some people might get confused because they saw about the recent rash of executions under the Trump administration in Terre Haute, Indiana. That's the federal system. Indiana's system, it was Michigan City, Indiana State Prison. And whenever they were doing an execution, they would lock the place down because the prisoners quite often felt solidarity with some of the people being executed. There were some prisoners who even the prisoners were like, that guy deserves to die. He should have died years ago. And so, I think things like that are worth taking into account. It may be that it's practically impossible in an institutional way to have a just use of capital punishment in the United States at present. And I think the people who are like really pro capital punishment, very often when you look at them, they're really pro retribution, and that's what they're into. All right, Edwin Boyette, rating Dio under rat sounds like a hemlock-worthy offense. I didn't do that. I don't know what you were listening to, but Dio and Rat are both really, top-tier bands. Let's see here. Dator, what in your opinion would be the best book to introduce someone to Stoicism? Epictetus's Enchiridion. And then Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and then maybe Seneca's On the Happy Life. Nice short works that can be read that are gateways. I mean, if you want to read secondary sources, you go right on ahead, but why not jump right into the straight stuff, rather than get somebody else's pre-digested things, Let's see here. Poetic Gore, any chance of getting some Jean Baudrillard videos? I'm usually shooting stuff on who I'm teaching. I don't teach Baudrillard very often, but if somebody wants to commission them, they can always reach out to me. I've done commissioned videos in the past. Rush Paul, you've lectured about so many different philosophers. Do you imagine you'll talk about Schopenhauer anytime soon? Yeah, I've actually got some that I've been meaning to shoot, some core concept videos on his discussions of ethics. Just never got to it. Probably will this summer, hoping to. Let's see here. Eric, do you listen to other genres of metal besides hair? Hair is not a genre. Classic metal, is so Donna Weinstein, who you should probably read. She's got a great sociology of metal. She talks about in the 80s there being three big super genres, the sort of middle of the road, what we call traditional classic heavy metal, which includes Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Motorhead, Dio. That's not hair metal. That's something quite different. When we talk about hair metal, we're talking usually about glam, softer sound, a bit more production. And then there's thrash and early black sort of extreme metal over there. And so hair metal, if you're using hair metal to describe classic metal, you're misusing the term. And it's better to talk about glam or pop or stuff like that for, Winger or Cinderella or Poison or stuff like that. I've never really been that into that. The one band that is definitely in that segment in terms of looks, actually two bands that I like, but they've got a harder edge to them that I've always liked are Twisted Sister and Rat. Motley Crue, actually, I only like the very early stuff. I didn't like Theater of Pain. I thought they'd kind of gone off the deep end. There are some bands that look glam but have a harder edge to them as well, like Lizzie Borden, who I like. But you really want to, like, if you're gonna generalize about metal, you got to get these terms down in some ways. All right, let's go out on one more if we can. Let's see here. There's something in here. Oh, yeah. Adventurous Rover, have you studied Transcendentalism? What are your thoughts? So Transcendentalism is like a kind of a movement. It's not a single philosophy. And yeah, I've studied it and I've taught it in classes. I'm not an expert on it, but I find it enjoyable. One interesting thing, by the way, they got their understanding of what was happening in Germany largely through Samuel Coleridge, who did a good bit of writing on that stuff. Let's see, any other easy things to tackle? Well, here's a good one to go out on, and my advice to you is going to be, unfortunately, there's not much you can do. Zach says, I have a friend who can't stop talking about Jordan Peterson. Any advice on how to get him to read around more? All he does is watch Peterson without checking his sources or reading the people he accuses of POMO. Not much you can do with somebody like that. I mean, I would actually like set down limits and say, and I've done this with people in the past who are like totally fixated on some second rate, not very deep, often quite confused, semi-philosophical stuff. You say, listen, I've heard what you say about that. I'm not interested in that. If you want to have a conversation about something else, hit me up and I'll be happy to do that. But I've heard your shtick and I'm not into that. And if that means that we can't hang out much anymore, that sucks for you, sucks for me, but that's your choice, buddy. And you could also keep the door open and say, like, when you're done with that, come see me. And sometimes people do that and sometimes people don't. Sometimes they're like, screw you, who are you to tell me, blah, 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 blah. That's a sign that you're probably not going to maintain that friendship, that it's too much is being demanded on your end and they're not giving what they ought to be giving. And then, like Seneca says, when you lose a friend, find another friend. You can find people who aren't so into that. And this is a natural process that has to happen. So, all right. Well, I didn't get to everybody's questions. I never do. But thanks to everybody for joining me. I will be having the 100,000 subscriber party tomorrow. All of you are welcome to join for that. We're going to celebrate hitting that milestone after only 10 years. And I'm going to talk a little bit about getting there and about some of the plans I've got for the channel going forward. But thanks to everybody for joining me and the good questions and comments. And I will either see you there or see you next AMA or at one of the other online events.